And without further ado, I would like to welcome the director of First Draft, Claire Wardle.
Thanks so much, Nell, and thank you everybody for joining us. I'm looking at the chat and there's some friends in the chat, so hello to everybody I know. Hello to everybody else. Oh, we're so grateful that you've joined us. It's been a long year of Zooms, and so the fact that you've chosen to spend another hour with us, we're incredibly grateful. So as some of you know, we published a report about a month ago called Under the Surface, and it was a pretty major piece of research run by First Draft's research manager, Rory Smith, who I'm going to introduce in a second. And he's going to kick off the webinar with just 10 minutes, giving us a little overview of the research. And we wanted this webinar to be an opportunity for people to ask questions about the issues raised by the research. So we've kind of got a stellar lineup today. I'm incredibly excited to have the three of our panelists who've agreed to join us. So the first is Glenn Nowak, who I have not met before, but he stepped in for Bruce Gellin, who unfortunately couldn't make it. And it turns out that Glenn is actually the director of the Grady College Center for Health and Risk Communication at the University of Georgia, worked for a long time at the CDC, worked in press relations, has lots of experience in terms of all of the issues that we're going to talk about today. So we're very excited to have Glenn here. So Glenn, do you want to say hi, anything that I've missed so people can know how expert you are?
Oh, no, thank you for the invitation. And I'm happy to be here. As Claire mentioned, I was at the CDC for about 14 years, including 6 years as Director of Communications for the National Immunization Program and 6 years as Director of Media Relations for CDC, including during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, and look forward to the presentations.
Great, thanks so much, Glenn. And then we also have Ifeoma Uzoma, who is one of my all-time legends, who some of you may know was at Pinterest and really spearheaded the decision to take pretty firm action on vaccine misinformation back in 2019. She now has just founded her own consultancy called Earthseed, continues to do incredible work on many things. But Ifeoma, do you want to talk about why you're going to say a number of spicy things, I suspect, on this webinar?
I don't know how spicy, but thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited about the conversation because I think especially now when there will be a lot more reporting on vaccines and particularly misinformation, we have to be really mindful of the way that we characterize people's hesitancy and specific communities. And so I'm really excited about talking about that. And then also looking at the ways that reporters and the community in general need to hold tech companies accountable, because a lot of the misinformation that we're seeing and that is harmful is actively being spread and not really being addressed by the companies, at least not in an effective manner.
This is why everybody should always have a phone. Whenever I hear a pharmacy come in the back of the room, be like, whoop, whoop, or the back of the Zoom. And finally, also a friend of First Draft, Jen Schwartz, who is a senior reporter at Scientific American and has done a lot of reporting around information disorder. And so Jen, I'm sure, is currently having these kind of conversations in her newsroom. But welcome, Jen. What else? Tell everybody how amazing you are.
Yes, so I actually mainly edit at Scientific American. I've edited Claire, her excellent work on just helping people create a language around how we talk about misinformation. I think it's sort of stunning, even from when she first wrote for us a year and a half ago, how much this space has expanded, and it's gotten both much more granular and just much more pervasive in how, and hopefully, you know, how we think about things. And certainly as Scientific American, not just how we cover, you know, how we understand disinformation, but how we report on anything as well, and how we factor those things into our editorial decisions. So we just had a special report in our November issue about confronting misinformation, and we're thinking about how we're going to apply a lot of these techniques to the vaccine rollout, among other issues of recovery.
Great, thanks so much, Jen. We're excited to have you too. So I'm going to hand over to Rory, just to let you know, some of you have already submitted really excellent questions. So I've got some already teed up, but if after hearing from our panelists, you have questions that you want to start sharing, please put them in the Q&A part of the bottom of the Zoom, and I will be monitoring them and then asking questions towards the end of the webinar. But Rory, I'm going to hand over to you. Rory is our research manager. He spent hours and hours and hours looking at parts of the internet that nobody else wants to, and I've asked him to just do a very 10-minute briefing on some of the key learnings from the research. So over to you, Rory.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to start my screen share here quickly. Fantastic. All right, yeah, so I hope everyone's doing well. My name is Rory Smith, and I'm the research manager at First Draft, and I co-authored our recent vaccine research report, Under the Surface, COVID-19 Vaccine Narratives, Misinformation, and Data Deficits on Social Media. So the origins of it were that in kind of mid-June, we noticed from our kind of global monitoring efforts that conversations were shifting away from the nature and spread of the coronavirus towards the race to develop a vaccine against it. Now, in order to make sense of the online vaccine information environment, we designed a piece of research with two main objectives in mind. And those were, one, to map the different vaccine narratives across multiple languages so as to better understand the online conversations and determine whether these narratives differed across languages and regions. And two, to identify vulnerable areas, or what we call data deficits, in this information ecosystem, which could be filled with mis and disinformation. And in this way, we could better kind of navigate the months ahead that we all knew were going to revolve around the race to find an eventual COVID-19 vaccine. Now, we put the concept of narratives at the forefront of this research instead of individual posts, as it is narratives that ultimately shape our attitudes and behavior. Now, we often focus too much on individual posts and whether they should be taken down or debunked. But it's actually individual pieces of misinformation are the atoms of content that make up these broader narratives. And unlike individual posts, we can't simply debunk or label narratives. They are too closely aligned with our sense of self and how we make sense of the world. And unlike a single post, a narrative can not only determine or undermine trust in vaccines, but also in the very institutions of science. But because narratives are flexible and can be repurposed to new contexts, in this case, new vaccines, we chose to analyze conversations around all vaccines, not just COVID-19 vaccines. But because of the time frame we were looking at, obviously a large portion of the posts we were looking at did relate to COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccines. So we manually coded 1,200 of the most engaged with social media posts in English, French, and Spanish from a range of social media platforms between mid-June and mid-September. And as you can see here at the top of this infographic, we mapped out the dominant topics of vaccine conversations and then identified the specific narratives that fell within each one of these topics. Now, we found that narratives concerning the political and economic motives around vaccines development and the actors and institutions connected to them were driving as much, if not more, of the online conversation than concerns around safety, efficacy, and necessity. And while we found that the top three topics of conversation were similar across all languages, we also found that specific topics such as liberty and freedom, as well as different narratives, did show differences across languages and regions. Now, as I mentioned above, the second objective was to identify key vulnerability areas in the information online space that were not only currently being exploited by mis and disinformation, but that had the potential in the future to become significant issues. And we qualify these vulnerable areas as data deficits, and they occur in situations where demand around or demand for information around a particular topic is high, but the amount of credible information around that topic is low. And unlike data voids, which are simply when kind of search results don't return anything or returning readily available information around a topic, deficits are situations in which results or posts may exist, but they are often misleading, confusing, false, or just generally unhelpful. Now, we identified various data deficits in our report. Chief among them was the mRNA technology here. But since the report was published, it's interesting that this deficit has been at kind of the forefront of all the misinformation that has resulted in the wake of the vaccine trial announcements. Now, the technical complexity associated with mRNA vaccines makes short, accessible information difficult to produce as well as promote. However, filling these data deficits in with accessible and reliable information early on is vital to preventing mis and disinformation from taking hold in the first place. Now, other other deficits we mentioned have also seen a subsequent increase in related misinformation in the wake of these vaccine trial announcements. And essentially to demonstrate that it is possible to identify these data deficits early on and then use that information to inform and guide proactive efforts to fill them in with reliable and accessible information. Now, in the report, we also detail a number of tactics used to fill these deficits or exploit these deficits. And while we have noticed an uptick in narratives aimed at undermining trust in mRNA vaccines from online sources that are anti-West or associated with kind of foreign actors, we have also seen a lot of run-of-the-mill approaches, such as the repurposing of old vaccine tropes and narratives to fit this new context. And they are arguably equally as powerful as some of the more elaborate tactics. So what's interesting is that the narratives and data deficits we mapped between mid-June and mid-September are arguably even more relevant now. Now, each of the misleading posts I have here on this screen relate to a data deficit or are filling in a data deficit that we mapped before any of these vaccine trial announcements. But what's also interesting is that aside from the top right tweet, which was published directly after the Pfizer announcement, every single one of these was published in the last few days, essentially underlining how, if we are, or essentially underlining the importance of like mapping data deficits and how they could potentially have a real strong impact on preempting the emergence of misinformation. Now, the last part of our research was setting out a series of kind of recommendations for policymakers, communications professionals, journalists, and researchers, kind of all of whom play essential roles in ensuring that the public has easy access to reliable information related to vaccines. And as you can see, there are quite a few recommendations. So I am just going to pick out the first two, as well as the last recommendation. So one is that we need to stop relying on fact-checking efforts and platforms' content moderation policies to address misinformation emerging from data deficits, meaning that we need to get better about monitoring for and identifying data deficits by ourselves in order that we can produce and promote quality messaging that preempts the emergence of misinformation. And recommendation two is that we need to appreciate the narratives and even topic differences across the languages and regions and respond appropriately. So whilst different topics and narratives are seemingly quite universal, there are nuances there and there are cultural and regional idiosyncrasies that need to be taken into account when designing messaging. And if they're not, we may very well miss the mark in terms of providing that messaging. And if nothing else, our research kind of underlined that there is an increase in mistrust or possibly even a crisis in mistrust in health institutions and health professionals right now. And that we need to find a way for health experts to connect with those who are questioning vaccine safety without validating or amplifying concerns. And this will ultimately, this kind of transparency will be fundamental to rebuilding trust in health authorities and institutions. So I know that was an absolute whirlwind tour through our research report. I will plug in a link for those that haven't seen it or are interested in the chat here. And as it says below, please don't hesitate to reach out to Claire, myself, or Seb, who is another author on this report, if you have any subsequent questions. So thank you very much, and I will hand it back over to Claire.
So much, Rory. I really appreciate it. And as you said, you're going to put the link into the chat so people can read it if they haven't had a chance to already. Okay, so I'm going to kick off the questions and I'm going to take, so you have time to think about it. I just want to kind of do a bit of a level playing field. For the three of you, can you think of examples of things that you think the media are doing really well right now and something you think they're doing less well? And so I'm going to kick off just with some things, some examples of things that I've seen. So earlier this week, I was listening to WNYC in the morning, and they were talking about the challenges to distribution. And the reporter said, there's going to be screw ups. Some of this vaccine is not going to be used because we won't keep it cold enough. Some of it will have to be thrown away. But that's what we expect. And there will be lessons learned and we will get better, but that's okay. And I sort of had this moment, I stopped as I was making my cup of tea, being like, it's so rare for us to actually acknowledge that there's going to be mistakes. And so a lot of the work that we see when we monitor is people taking advantage of when things go wrong and it's not addressed. So that's something that I really felt like that was good, to be much more honest about it. The thing that I'm seeing that I'm really worried about is mainstream media, for example, posting on Facebook to say, hey, are you going to get vaccinated? ? And then all of the comments are, no, because it's full of aluminium. No, because it's going to change my DNA. No, blah, 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 blah. And there's nobody in those comments. And all of a sudden it's a real problem. So I just think this kind of providing space for people to talk about vaccines, but not thinking about ways to moderate that or to have expertise is something I'm a little bit worried about. But maybe Glenn, what are you seeing at the moment that you're like, yes, thumbs up, or ooh, we learned in 2009 that was a bad idea?
I think, you know, the things that impressed me that they've been doing really well is devoting time and attention to these vaccines, and a lot of stories about how these vaccines have come to be and the experiences of the first people being vaccinated. Because I think a lot of people are interested in what is going to be the experience of those first people to receive these vaccines. So I think that they've done really well. What I worry about going forward is how are they going to handle vaccine safety and adverse event claims? Because those things typically, under the best of circumstances, are very challenging to communicate. And there's a lot of nuance that is involved when it comes to vaccine safety issues.
Yeah, I completely agree, Glenn. Ifeoma, what are you seeing that's thumbs up, thumbs down?
I guess for thumbs up, contextualizing the issues in distribution and why we are going to have not everyone get the vaccine at the same time, and certain groups are going to get them. Here in New Mexico, our governor has done an incredible job, and the reporting, at least locally, has been great into the government's thought process, locally at least, in distribution for healthcare workers, and then for folks in long-term care facilities, and then even the distribution in the northwest corner of the state, where Navajo Nation has faced one of the worst outcomes in the US because of historical inequities. Speaking to the historical inequities portion, though, where I think the media has not done as great of a job, is I've heard, whether it's on NPR or read in the New York Times or wherever else, people refer to specific communities, Black communities, Native, Latinx communities, and say things like they are less likely to take the vaccine. Less likely because of what? Like, if you're not explaining historical injustices and a real lack of trust because of things that have actually happened and been done by the government, then you're not actually fully contextualizing why there may be hesitancy. And my fear with that is it actually doubles down on the misinformation that is particularly being targeted at these communities and is specifically meant to drive up distrust.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true, in that I worry slightly there's so much focus on misinformation as though that's the only problem, and there's a complete failure to recognize history and legacy that has left a real mark, and it's not being discussed at the level that we need. Jen, what are you seeing?
Well, I would just follow up on that point that, you know, and I think it really varies. I think in some places you are seeing more of the context, and in others it's more of this straightforward idea that the vaccine is a silver bullet, and that, it kind of made me laugh in Rory's presentation of like, just take the vaccine and everything will go back to normal. I think that sort of framing of over relying on the vaccine as a solution is not going to help people. It might seem like it might help people, but it actually doesn't, because it leaves so much room open for people's hesitancies and concerns not to be addressed. And, part of what I have seen that makes me hopeful, or what is positive, is when the reporting shows the importance of getting like local trusted leaders to be partners in how we communicate about the vaccine. To take into account that there is so much historical context about why people might be hesitant, and to have more conversations about the history of medical racism, of all sorts of cultural, just influences where, and not to mention the fact that we've had so many vacillations in just what our national leadership has said, and so many contradicting points that in fact, it would be quite rational in many cases for people to be concerned. And I think when there's too much focus on, oh, there are deniers, just like climate change, people deny that, the virus exists, or they just don't want the vaccine. They think it's, has microchips in it for surveillance. You're missing all the people in the middle who have legitimate concerns and need that information. And I think that there's not enough reporting targeted at that very large middle group.
That's so important, because I think even the terms like vaccine hesitant, movable middle, vaccine skeptic. I mean, Glenn, you've obviously been doing this work for a long time. From a kind of a communications perspective, how important it is to think about those different groups and the necessity for different types of messaging?
It's very important because I learned when I was at the immunization program pretty quickly that when it comes to things like vaccines, you typically have three broad categories of people. You have the people who trust you, who are very interested in vaccines, understand vaccines. Your messaging mostly is about when can I get the vaccine, where could I get the vaccine, and that's what they're interested in. You have people at the other end of the spectrum who are deeply, deeply distrustful and skeptical of vaccines. They're distrustful of mainstream medicine. They don't trust government officials. They're going to be really hard to persuade. But the people in the middle are often the largest group. They're the people who have legitimate questions. They're reluctant. It's understandable they're reluctant, that they have questions that they want to be answered. And I think you're right. We can get so focused on the people at the far extreme who will never convince and will never persuade and who are relatively small in number. And we need to focus on the people who are open-minded, who have concerns, who are looking for answers. And if the answers are satisfactory, they will get vaccinated. They may not be the first to get vaccinated, but if we can develop a trusting relationship, they will get vaccinated.
So I'm going to get to the kind of the meat of why this is hard. And I struggle with this every day in terms of even our tiny editorial output, is that what's the role of the media in terms of thinking about public interest? Because in a public health situations we're in, there's this argument that the vaccine will help us as a society. If I'm the CDC, I've got a reason to get people vaccinated. But if I'm a journalist like Jen, my role is to ask tough questions to make sure that those questions are being answered. And by asking those questions, I might therefore be giving ammunition to those who want to weaponize this situation. And so this tightrope walk of what is the role of journalism on something like a vaccine that is so young and untested, and people have questions, but yet the focus on that could cause harm. So Jen, how much of this are you thinking about? How are you struggling with these questions?
I mean, I think you're right in that, so much of my job is to deal in nuance, and always, not just with the pandemic, but in an environment where we are learning something so rapidly, it's very difficult to think about how do you put the best available evidence out there that we have at the time, and say, hey, this is the best we have to work off of to start to make decisions, and have the larger goal in mind of keeping people safe, and balancing, lots of different goals that we have as a country. And so when we think about public interest, as a journalist who covers misinformation, I think, oh my gosh, in every sentence or in every headline, how could you be inadvertently putting something out there that could get used, that could be miscontextualized, turned around, and used as a reason for why people should not trust science or trust, vaccine protocol. And so I think it's very difficult, but a guiding light for me is always to keep reminding, right in a very clear and consistent way in everything we do. This is the best we know at the time. and remind people we will keep learning. And that's how we know that science is working and that good policy is working, when policy is based off of evidence as we receive it, and we are having a truly inclusive conversation with experts across the board about the best ways to put this information into practice. I think that level of transparency, we don't have to get into the weeds all the time, but reminding people of process and validating concerns, to me seems to be a very helpful way to just build back the trust that is really central before we can start thinking about convincing. I think about more about how as a journalist can we build back that trust in everything that we do.
Yeah, and so for example, the Solutions Journalism Network, which has for a number of years been pushing the need for more explainers, for stories that actually give people tools. And there's sometimes this snootiness from more traditional journalists who are like, it's not my job to do that. And I hope that we're now moving into a moment of that it's so critical that journalists are responding to the questions that their audiences have. Because if you look at Google Trends and what people are asking questions about, when there aren't the answers, it's the data deficit situation that Rory's talking about. So to me, it's how can we connect the dots with, as you're saying, Jen, the process, giving people a wider complexity. Also, I love that you say your job's about nuance because of your sign behind your head that says it depends. It kind of sums up everything that you were saying. Okay, so I'm trying to ask questions that are coming in from the audience. And one of them actually, Ifoma, I'm going to ask you to talk about, which is the Plandemic video, which maybe not everybody's seen, but it emerged in May. It was a very slick 28-minute, looked like it could have been on Netflix, kind of attack on the system, and went after Dr. Fauci, and it was very conspiratorial and it got incredible traffic. And the platforms were very late to move on it. The media did a lot of amplification of the video. So even if you hadn't seen it, you started searching for it. And then Plandemic 2 came out sometime later in the summer, and it didn't have the same kind of moment. And I wonder, Ifoma, did you see a difference there about maybe the ways that the platforms or the newsrooms reacted that might have helped with that?
For the second one, my understanding about why it didn't go as viral is, one, it wasn't novel like the first one. And then the platforms took more action in curbing its spread and not and removing it actually from some platforms. One thing that I'll say about the reporting is that what has concerned me is that not all of the health reporters that I've seen who have been writing about misinformation or about COVID specifically understand reporting on misinformation. And that is where you run into problems because, and you guys at First Draft have done an excellent job of advising reporters and newsrooms on not just amplifying and actually explaining. One step further that I think that reporters could take, and newsrooms in general, is explaining the motivations of some of the folks who make things like the Plandemic videos, because not all of them are just passionate about the anti-vaccine crusade. Many of them are actually making money. And I think it'd be really valuable to explain the financial incentives that drive all of this and really compare it to spam and the way that spam works online. It's obviously much more harmful than any spam that you see on a day-to-day basis, but the way that it works is very similar. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of the conversation, because the way that I've seen it reported, at least when it is reported, very much makes it seem like there's some sort of mission that these folks are behind, or they're passionate about it. And when someone is passionate about something, you may lend more legitimacy to it than understanding that this is just a financial operation for many of the folks who are engaging in it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And there's a lot of research now around inoculation theory to that point, which is if you teach people the tactics and techniques that are being used to push misinformation, people are better at spotting it in the wild. Glenn, I was just going to come to you with a point, but so you follow up and then I'm going to ask you another question.
Yeah, it's a very good point that was just made. And I think the other thing I would say is that journalists need to hold the people who are making allegations to the same standards as they hold experts. Because that's the other thing, is that a person with an anecdote is like, okay, a scientist with an anecdote is not okay, right? And when you start delving, some of these pseudo experts start delving into science and health and medicine, asking them where their evidence is. Yeah, and why they're not advocating for more evidence for their claim, I think would be helpful, because otherwise it's an unfair playing field. One is held to a much higher evidence standard and the other is held to anecdotes.
Yeah, and Glenn, on that point, I mean, we've had other issues like this summer, there was a video with the frontline doctors all wearing their white coats on the steps of the Supreme Court. We've had the Great Barrington Declaration, which I'm just going to put into chat, which is other doctors saying actually the lockdown is having more effect. I mean, if you're a journalist, how do you deal with people who have a medical degree and are saying things? How can, when you talk about evidence, let's go back to 1999 with Andrew Wakefield, a British person who published in the Lancet and said, you know, vaccines, the MMR vaccine causes autism. It was later retracted. He had his medical license disappeared, but we're still living with the impact of that. So if you're a journalist, how do you make a decision about which doctor to take seriously? How do you, on a deadline, know how to assess evidence? This might seem very 101 for you, but I think it actually gets to the core of this moment of pseudoscience, and everybody can be an expert on the internet.
Well, I think it's a really difficult question. And I think it's a difficult challenge for journalists, right? Because it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of background knowledge to be able to take on somebody who is advocating for a position, and they've got a really deep knowledge base. You know, Andrew Wakefield's a good example. We struggled at CDC because he was willing to cut across medical disciplines. There was no lane that he stayed in. At CDC, people stayed in lanes. They were like, I study vaccines, I don't study autism. I study autism, I don't study vaccines. I study pediatrics, but I don't study that. So we had a real hard time coming up with an expert who was willing to talk to journalists, to talk about the claims being made by somebody who was crossing scientific disciplines, going back and forth, and had, you know, a little knowledge of every area, but didn't have in-depth knowledge. And I think so it poses a challenge for experts even. So for journalists, it would be incredibly difficult to be able to do that. I think the other thing that comes into play, though, is sometimes the media outlet is not interested in trying to resolve the controversy. They're really interested in covering the controversy, right? And so I think that's the other part of it, is what's the story primarily about? Is it about trying to help people better understand the controversy, or is it more about this side says this and this side says that? Isn't this an interesting controversy?
Yeah, I'm going to come to Jen on this, because this gets to, and we just had a great question raised around this, which is the both sidism aspect. So I lived in the UK during the Andrew Wakefield thing, and the BBC were busy saying, well, on one side we have Dr. Wakefield, and the other side, which was 99% of science. And of course, there was a lot of criticism, and there was a lot of reflection internally at the BBC about the mistakes that were made. But to Glenn's point, like, how as a newsroom can you think about objectivity around questions of science and health like this when there is not consensus, particularly around something new where there are people still raising questions and concerns?
Yeah, the chaos of false equivalency, which has been, I think, it's just been to new levels over the past 4 years in the US, and I'm sure in many other places, where you know, terms just get flipped on their head. And the way that, you know, there's sort of a, you know, journalists often feel like, you know, you have to address this thing that's being said, even though, as we all know here, that, you know, repeating information, misinformation, even in the context of trying to explain why it's wrong, can make people just believe it. You know, repeating it at all, you know, entrenches the wrong, false belief. And so it's very tricky. I think, though, to this point about what do you do with maybe, you know, rogue is, you know, not the entirely perfect word to describe scientists who go outside the realm, but we've seen this in many cases just with the pandemic. I mean, you know, hesitant to name names, but, you know, you look at what happened with like John Ioannidis, and even with, you know, George Church and putting out their own vaccine. You look at this and you say, well, we talk a lot about institutional distrust, but people trust people. They don't necessarily trust an institution. And when you see these big leaders who, you know, were trusted in many different ways, it's very difficult to all of a sudden go, oh, that doesn't seem right. That's not what, you know, how consensus seems to be working. What do you do with that person? And I think it's that's why institutions are important. And And as journalists, to remember that, like, any individual piece of information, still needs to be thought of in the context of what are other experts saying about it. I mean, you never just quote the one person. You always have to go to the independent researchers who, who did not work on the paper. And that's really tricky in a deadline-driven environment, but it's so important now to think about how trust is developed, and that we trust, people don't just trust institutions, they're trusting other people and figures. And so how do you draw that together and not just say, trust the CDC, but give better examples and hold up leaders who are doing the work, the hard work and necessary work of smart public health communication on these fronts?
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I really struggle to see all the coverage of the Pfizer and Moderna rollouts when you basically just saw the press release regurgitated. And it was like, that's not helping anybody. And actually AstraZeneca, it then transpired, had kind of tried to hide a couple of things. I mean, it was really not done well in an age of networked audiences that were busy Googling things. I mean, so then again, we don't have any space to make mistakes. But the challenge, as you're saying, Jen, like Pfizer releases the press release, what are you going to do? Hold back and go to Pfizer and say, I need to know all of this? I mean, they just didn't release enough data. So I think it's on all of us to ask the questions, but also in an environment that says, yeah, sometimes reporting too early we're gonna bear the brunt of that later. If I wanted to come back to, we're getting great questions, by the way, so please keep adding them. But going back to this challenge of certain communities, for good reason, being distrustful. What is the role of newsrooms who we already know are, many of them do not have, are not inclusive, do not represent the audience in ways that they should? If I'm working in a newsroom and I'm like, oh, I feel like I do not have the expertise, what are some ideas that people can, is it about connecting with community media outlets? What are some ways that maybe journalists can think about this challenge?
I think definitely connecting with local and community relevant journalists and media organizations is a helpful first step. But you also, there are resources that are available. Color of Change put together an incredible narrative guide that I recommend everyone reads on how to speak particularly about Black communities and the history of medical betrayal, honestly, by the government. There's a similar history for Latinx individuals, certainly for Native Americans in this country. And so I think understanding that history is necessary, especially if you're going to speak about a specific community and population. One thing that I'm interested in seeing and hoping takes place is a number of members of Congress have pushed the Biden administration to include a misinformation expert in the COVID work that's being done for the rollout. I would love to see that same thing happen at the state and local level, and for journalists to be asking questions what if it isn't happening, because I think that's where then we'll start to see more thoughtfulness around the ways that misinformation are affecting specific communities, because that can't be done effectively at a federal level. It just can't. And I think that focusing on those stories at the state and local level may actually build trust, because people are going to see more examples of the ways that misinformation is spreading in their communities and the reasons why they should be more, I guess, thoughtful in what they're consuming and how it affects a public health decision that everyone is going to be making over the next 12 months.
I totally agree. I wish we had misinformation experts in every state. Glenn, I wanted to turn back to you as somebody who's obviously been involved in public health emergencies, crises in different times, and times where we didn't necessarily have as much content on things like Facebook. There's a question here about, we know that whilst fact checking is important, it's somewhat limited, and you have to wait until after people have seen it. Do you have good ideas of how to build trust with people who want to ask questions of health experts? They are used to being participatory. They want to find out the truth themselves. They're turning to Google. How can we think of some innovative ways to kind of preempt some of the questions and concerns people have, rather than waiting for misinformation, then sticking a fact check on it?
Well, I think, two things. One is you can anticipate to some extent where some of the quote unquote misinformation is going to come from when it comes to things like new vaccines, new treatments, new medicines. There's often that line of question about how do you know it's safe? How do you know it's effective? What about this, right? I mean, a lot of what we're calling misinformation is probably people's misunderstanding. It's probably people who they haven't really had to care about this topic before. So there wasn't a coronavirus pandemic. So why would you care about coronavirus vaccines? Why would you care about mRNA vaccines as a technology? So I think you can anticipate that there's going to be a lot of interest up front about what are these things? How do you know they're safe? How do you know they're effective? What are you doing to monitor those things? So I think doing anticipatory guidance makes a lot of sense. In 2009, we did that from day one, where we had the first press briefing, where we talked about what we didn't know and how much that was going to affect what we did. We talked about how the fact that changes were going to happen quickly and unpredictably. And so if you saw them as a journalist, you shouldn't be surprised that really wasn't going to be a major news story, that happens all the time in these sorts of things. And then I think the latter part of the answer is you have to be able to have a lot of places have good information. So it's widely visible, easily accessible. People can go to places that they're typically using. They don't have to learn about new places. And again, a lot of it's local. So trying to develop the capacity of communities, coalitions, that's where a lot of things that are going to be most effective are really going to happen. It's not going to be, as has been mentioned, the federal government and federal government agencies.
And there's a great question that's come in that's a reminder of the global aspect to this. It's very easy when you're in the US to think that the rest of the world doesn't count. I say that as somebody who's from the rest of the world. But are there examples of other countries where we've seen trust in health and science go up during the pandemic? I mean, are there examples of where this is working really well? Does anybody know?
I'm not sure about for this pandemic. I would assume that trust is probably higher in places like Taiwan and New Zealand versus the United States. But I do think a good example of a recent pandemic is Ebola. And I'm disappointed, though not surprised, that more conversation in the US isn't around shaping our own rollout of the vaccine and talking, or the different vaccines, and talking to communities about all of the concerns they have around public health, because we're also in the middle of a financial crisis, and you can't try to convince someone to get themselves and their children vaccinated when they're thinking about food and they can't feed their kids this week or this month. And so I think that we need to take an approach similar to the approach that's been lauded around the world of the health workers in Central and West Africa, who really did the door-to-door work of evangelizing the Ebola treatment that they were sharing. And I think it was incredibly successful, but is not being focused on because it wasn't something that affected the Western world.
And I was going to say, I just add on to that. I think the Western world, and I noticed that when I started working in immunization programs, there's not a strong tradition of vaccine education and vaccine communications. It's mostly been, these vaccines will speak for themselves. The benefits will be so inherently obvious, everybody will want them. And I think we've seen over the past 15 years, particularly, that is not the case. People have lots of questions, lots of doubts. They want to know, why are these things important? Yes, the benefits can be obvious, but that's not the only thing that gets people willing to take a vaccine. But we've never had a tradition in public health of making significant investments, including the kinds of efforts we do in other parts of the world to get people comfortable with vaccines. We don't use those things in the Western world to help people understand vaccines.
Yeah, Glenn, I cannot nod more. I actually had a bit of a rant on Twitter the other day about, I'm on so many convenings where people like keep saying, we just need to get the right messages, the right influencers, the right formats, and we'll be fine. And all of the evidence, exactly to Ifoma's point, and it was actually a new article that came out of the UK, which is we should be doing co-creation with communities. It has to look like that. And that we absolutely, as Ifoma said, have that model. I just was very lucky to work on a WHO training, and public health professionals like, I don't know why this is a mystery to everybody. We did this with HIV, we did this with Ebola. We know. The thing thing is, it's resource intensive and it's not quick. And people want a quick fix, and it doesn't exist, because actually the complexity of the phase that we're going through requires conversations. And actually, I might drop a great link in from On the Media about a Black pastor in Pittsburgh saying, yeah, we made some changes in the community, but it was about door knocking and talking and listening to each other and having empathy. And that is not quick, but it's the only way to go. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Does anybody have any thoughts about, I mean, it's slightly off topic because we're meant to be talking about journalism, but the US government, kind of the idea that there's, you know, the public campaigning around this. I mean, I think we saw recently a story that they've got $250 million to spend on this. What advice would you be giving the US government about this moment? Who wants to start?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one, and I've actually had the opportunity to do this, is a lot of this does take place at the community level. And so if you're going to spend a lot of resources on vaccine communications and education, you got to be working across a wide variety of communities, and not just geographic communities. You got to be working across other communities as well. And you have to be willing to invest those resources there. To think that just a national television campaign with public service and paid TV spots is going to do that is incredibly naive. It's not that simple. It'll get the first group of people, the people who just tell me when and where, but it's not probably going to make much headway among the people who are taking a wait and see attitude. And it's not going to have any impact on people who have much more distrust and reluctance.
Ifeoma, did I see, or Jen, you took your microphone off.
Oh, you know, I was just gonna follow up on this and say it's invest more money into communication. You know, I know there's been, you know, I've seen like, yeah, we're going to have one misinformation expert, you know, as part of a task force or whatever it is, but it needs to be so much bigger than that. And you know, I've talked to a lot of healthcare workers throughout the pandemic, you know, talking about trauma and just what their lives are like in confronting a lot of this. And like one thing that comes up is we just don't have a healthy healthy public health network in this country where there's trust between, you know, communities and their healers. And so this is not just about like getting a message and trickling it down, but about how do you develop partnerships with people and understand what the needs are, as opposed to dictating what the needs are for everyone, so that those resources can be used more efficiently and invested in the places where that work is already being done on the ground. I mean, you know, grassroots and smaller community you know, knowledge is already there in many cases. It's about listening to it and then investing resources so that knowledge can travel in more effective ways.
So we're getting towards the end, and I realize that we haven't really talked about kind of disinformation actors in this space. For a lot of this year, we were obviously working with newsrooms around the election and making sure that they were prepared for election misinformation. And there are definitely parallels here, but we actually did a crisis simulation, which Jen experienced, where we kind of threw people into an active disinformation campaign. I mean, how prepared do we think health and science reporters are about the particular challenges of those who are trying to target the information landscape? Do you think we sort of need to do more training with science and health reporters? Or do you think there's an awareness because of the discussions about misinformation? Maybe I could ask you to start, Jen.
And I think more training is always useful. I do think that there's been, at least in my newsroom, there's been so much acknowledgement of the way around the election and around, you know, we're Scientific American, we cover science. So the pandemic has been, you know, we've been hyper aware of these issues. But I think it's always worth understanding what the acute issues are in the moment and how narratives are changing in real time. And I think the idea of anticipating what the needs are, you know, again, we are a national and global outlet, but I think there's such a huge opportunity for local newsrooms around the world to say, what are the issues in my community? Who are the groups who are working on this? Who do we need to call up and interview to, you know, quote in our stories so that we can hear back, you know, voices from the community about what the concerns are here. And then as a journalist, how do I explain things, you know, and put it all there transparently. And I think getting specific like that and anticipating what the needs are will also just help journalists stay more focused on the task, as opposed to getting sort of distracted and overwhelmed every time there's, a pandemic, video, that you don't have to just knee-jerk respond to everything. And, you can re-promote some of the explainers you've already done to sort of flood, to create this, may have it be available. And I think that will just like preserve sanity and resources of individual journalists and newsrooms who are already so strapped. To how can we put our heads down and see what the most important places are to focus?
And Glenn, do you think, as you see many reporters having to write about health and science when they don't have a health and science background or training, do you kind of sit there shaking your head being like, I need to offer a lot more training for journalists about how to read scientific studies?
Yeah, and even for health and science journalists, I mean, this stuff gets really specialized. I mean, the people who are the experts are specialized, right? I mean, they do nothing but vaccines. And so I think the more you can do to help any journalist understand what this environment looks, the reporting environment they're in looks like, and the key things that they need to understand to be able to make their stories as accurate as possible, and the context that they need to help their readers understand is really helpful. And again, saying that you have to make the trainings quick, easy, because journalists are busy, right? And editors aren't going to let them spend 2 days at a workshop. Because a lot of them have deadlines and are working on multiple stories. And so you have to be able to find other ways besides training, such as your resources on websites, that would help journalists do that. And I think that's important too.
Yeah. So again, we're sort of near the top. What do you think, just any last pieces of advice? Because I feel like this has been a useful conversation, but I'm still trying to think about what are landmines that people are going to fall into. I think my concern is that the information landscape is one that's going to be weaponized. And that, as we've seen in 2020, the way that science works is it's about data, it's about replicating experiments, and consensus doesn't happen quickly. And for a journalist, how do you report on that without causing more harm? So I think what we've learned in 2020 is that the time it took for institutions to agree that masks worked, the time it took us to say airborne transmission is a problem, has caused real challenges in 2020. And so what can we think about as advice as we go into 2021 around vaccines, which is the need for, people want certainty. And if they don't get it from quality information providers, they go to Google, because the conspiracy theorists give them certainty. They give them simple, powerful explanations. Over here, we're like Jen, we're like, well, it depends. In our signs, and people are like, I don't want it to depend, I want to know. So I think that's a good place to end, which is, how do we balance people's need for certainty with the fact that that's not how science works? Maybe I'll start with Ifoma.
I think reiterating that that's literally the scientific process is a good place to start, and helping people understand that science is about asking questions, sometimes asking them over and over and over again until you get an answer that may change, because that's just science. As we learn things, we share them. One thing that I'm hoping for, since we're not getting the data, and I don't think we will, from the tech companies, is more reporting on the ways that information is flowing, because it's not just what we're seeing on Facebook and on Twitter. A lot of it is happening in private spaces and in messaging apps. And I only think that's going to come from reporting. So I'm hoping to see more of that, because I think the more of it that's exposed and actually discussed and analyzed, the less effective the misinformation is.
No, and I think actually that says a lot for developing tip lines with your audience, to say misinformation is going to cause harm to our communities. We want to work with you to help navigate all of these rumors, but we might not be seeing them. So yeah, I think that's great advice. Jen?
Claire, I think you had written for us in our November issue that, and this was about the election, but that people should spend their time not debating what is true and what is false, but talking to each other that misinformation harms us all. And, to Ifoma's point, like, we need to just be talking more as journalists about, there's misinformation, which is just, false belief, but there's also so many, there are just so many areas in which people have incentives to spread harmful messaging, and the way that it is amplified, algorithmically. And I think that the more that we talk about how that works and make people just a little bit more aware, that it certainly helped me. As you know, Claire, I wrote about like putting myself in the shoes of a disinformation agent to really feel the motivation. And it's very powerful when you no longer have to like use evidence-based anything, and you're just targeting people's emotions. And it's powerful, and people are outraged or they're totally agreeing with you. And it's, you really see how emotionally charged and that this space can be, and how grievances, legitimate grievances, can be exploited so quickly, and how in the context where we're in, where there's so much instability and uncertainty in the world. I mean, my gosh, it's just ripe for this stuff to spread and for us to be exploited by it. So I think talking more about that, and as journalists, always thinking, how are people responding emotionally? How can I meet them where they are? What are their fears? What are their concerns? Not, oh, people need to understand the facts. How do I just explain them? But what are people scared about? How is their identity at risk with what's going on? And talking to them in a way that meets them where they are, as opposed to lecturing at them in this like vacuum. So I think that's really critical to keep talking about the emotional side of this, or even just using it as context in your own reporting of what you're pursuing and how you're explaining things.
Yeah, you make me think about those vaccine injury Facebook groups where people share images and stories about what happened to their children that you can't fact check, but it's just full of emotion. Then on the other side, you've got, the CDC putting out 187-page PDF. And I totally understand, but that's two very different playing fields. One is full of emotion and one isn't. Glenn, I'm going to give you the last minute to just give us a sense of how do we get through 2021.
I think what I would look for is that for the next few months, there's going to be probably a lot more vaccine demand than there's going to be vaccine supply. So it's going to look like things are going to go really swimmingly well. I think we got to be mindful of vaccine safety claims and allegations, particularly as the vaccine gets more widely used, and those will become more prominent and harder to be able to discern cause and effect, particularly if they're very rare. We should anticipate that there will be, as vaccine rollout expands, more people raising questions and concerns and trying to cast doubt. And that's going to be probably countered with efforts to have immunity passports. I think a lot of businesses, it's not going to be government agencies that are going to do this. It's going to be businesses, it's going to be airlines and others who are basically going to ask people for proof that they've been vaccinated. So we're going to see, I think, in 2021, significant progress toward reducing the spread of COVID-19 because of these vaccines. But it's not going to be a smooth and easy journey. And there's going to be a bunch of controversies and speed bumps along the way that I think journalists are going to be covering, and they're probably going to be challenged when they're covering those issues.
Oh my God, I think we need to do a weekly, what should we write this week? You just gave reporters at least 10 story ideas, I think. Thank you very much, everybody. This was a great conversation. I'm just putting one last link in, which is a piece that we put out this morning about data deficits, which Rory talked a little bit about. We will send out an email to everybody who attended. It's being recorded. A few of you said, oh, I missed the beginning, so you can watch again. But thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to Rory for all of your research this year. Happy holidays to everybody. 2021 is not going to be less busy. I promise you that. So thank you, everybody. Take care.